Okay. Hello and welcome back to another Pore Lab lecture series. Our today's speaker is Dr. Nima Shokri, Chair and Professor of Geo-Hydroinformatics at Hamburg University of Technology. He got his PhD in mechanics of solid and fluids from EPFL University in 2009. His research focuses on hydrophysic processes, environmental physics, and energy-related challenges. Today, he will talk about pore-scale physics controlling solute transport and crystallization in porous media and how these processes control the global scale responses. Thank you, Nima, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mohammad Hussein, for the nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here and to give this presentation. As you mentioned, the title of my talk is Soil Salinization from Pore to Global Scale Processes. And I am from the Institute of Geo-Hydroinformatics at TU Haha. This is the website of our institute. This talk today I have is only one of the active projects in our institute. But you can find much more detail about our research and what we do, our publication or whatever on this website. So today I'm going to talk about soil salinization from pore to global scale processes. Okay, so understanding of solute transport and crystallization in drying porous material is actually relevant to many disciplines, ranging from, I don't know, hydrology to building materials to powder technology to pharmaceutical industry to CO2 sequestration and so on. So this is so here you see an example of the cartoon shows the CO2 sequestration, the challenge they might be you might be facing during CO2 sequestration because of the crystallization. This is the paper from George, where he shows the effect of the crystallization on basically the durability of the building materials. This is the soil salinization. The picture is from Bushehr province in Iran. And again, you see the salinization effect. I will talk about that much more today, so I'm going to skip this picture. And this is, for example, one of our recent results where went actually to the cover of Soft Matter, where we look into the drawing of droplets containing nanoparticles. I think the size was like, I don't know, maybe 8 nanometer, 10 nanometer, something like that. So this science, this knowledge that it is required to describe solute transport and crystallization in porous material, they are relevant to all of these disciplines. Okay. And but I look at it, at least in this presentation, from environmental point of view, from hydrological point of view, okay? Because the issue of soil salinization is a global problem. So what do we mean by soil salinization? Salinization basically refers to the excess accumulation of salt in the soil, basically, that affects vegetation, plant growth, crop production, human health, and animals, and so on, okay? That is basically one of the main soil degrading process that is occurring, and so I'm going to give you here a couple of numbers to just give you an idea of the scale I'm talking about. This is a bit old one, that 1995, the estimate was 1995, like 25 years ago, 26 years ago, the $12 billion is lost as a result of the salinization, okay, globally. And nowadays, I believe it's much more than that. And this is a more updated estimate that is in 2016. The estimation was that we have about 900 million hectare of land, more than 900 million hectare of land has been affected by the issue of the soil salinity. And for example, in Europe, we have about 30 million hectare land as a saline soil, and in Spain, 3% of their 3.5 million hectare is already salt affected. That means it affects the productions, essentially the job and then the GDP of the country and so on. And also another 15% is under the risk of the soil salinization. Okay, so trust me, to buy today from me that the issue of the soil salinization. So it's important to understand how it works. Okay, and what are the mechanisms affecting soil salinization. Okay. So, but the prediction remains a challenge. Okay, there are many challenges when it comes to description of the predictive description of soil salinization, and one of them is that so as water evaporates from the porous material or soil, right, the concentration of the ion changes over time, and that basically affects the thermodynamic of the solution. Okay, and so that makes the prediction a little bit complicated, but this is manageable. There are ways you can handle that. But the more to me at least, the bigger challenge is that the issue of the crystallization. So here you see there are a couple of beads immersed in salty solution. This is before evaporation. That is how they look like, and that is after evaporation. So when the water is gone, the salt crystallizes, because when water evaporates, concentration increases, and then when it substantially exceeds the solubility limit, it precipitates, okay, or crystallizes, okay? And when salt crystallizes, it modifies the permeability of the porous media, okay? And so that therefore that affects the subsequent flow and transport processes occurring in porous material. Okay, so how exactly the evolution of this crystallized salt, because it's a dynamic process, the salt crystal as well goes through some evolution as well as the drying process. So how exactly the structure and dynamics of this salt influences the subsequent transport processes is still an open question, is not fully understood. Okay, so within this context, I introduced the objectives of my talk today is I like to talk a little bit about fundamentals of saline water evaporation, right? At the very small scale, the physics of the evaporation, how it works, okay? To investigate fundamental of saline water evaporation from porous media, from soil. And then I like to talk a little bit about to investigate salt precipitation and its consequences on evaporation. And then I like to link the pore-scale physics. This is a picture obtained by synchrotron X-ray tomography, okay, 7 millimeter here. So what we learn from such an experiment, right, at this small scale, how we can translate that, or how we can use this pore-scale information to the much larger scale, say the global scale. Okay, is there anything that we can learn from here that can be translated to the larger scale or not? So I like to talk a little bit about this upscaling. Okay, and so, but before I start my presentation, before talking about saline water evaporation, I have only one slide to talk about pure water evaporation. Okay, and then we will talk about saline water evaporation. So let's say if you have this cup, okay, you filled it with soil, with glass beads, with sand, or with water, with some sort of porous material. You fill it with water. You fill it with water and put it on a balance. You can actually check that in your kitchen. You just put it in a balance, and every day, every hour, every minute, every 5 hours, just go record the mass. And if you plot the curve on an Excel file, you will get that this is the drying rate. This is the drying rate. Let's see if this one works. Give me a second. Perfect, yeah. So this is the drying rate versus time, and you see the evaporation rate is initially, I would say, relatively constant. The relatively constant is just fluctuating, and all of a sudden, at a certain time, at a certain mass loss, you have a huge drop of the evaporation from, let's call it a stage 1 evaporation, right? This high evaporation rate to a much lower values. Okay, so I like to highlight here that look here for 20 days, right? For 20 days, this cup, you're losing water from here for 20 days. But the evaporation rate is not a function of the, or let's say it is less impacted by the amount of the water present in this domain you have, right? The evaporation rate is nearly constant and fluctuating, but at a particular time, there's a huge drop, okay? So that's stage 1, stage 2. There are lots of research on what controls stage 1 evaporation and stage 2 evaporation, how we can predict the end of stage 1, and so on. And we did a lot of work on that. In fact, my PhD, like a million years ago, my PhD was in this particular topic, that the characterization of the drying of the porous material. So I want to just like in a minute explain the physics behind that. So during a stage 1 one evaporation, as water evaporates, an interface form and goes down, recedes into the porous media. Here, this is the highlighted by this dark blue, okay? Although this is going down, there is always capillary flow connecting this receding drying front to the surface, okay? So there is this pass phase, the water comes up to the surface and evaporation occurs at the surface, okay? And that keeps the surface, although the saturated zone is at the bottom, this capillarity keeps the surface wet, okay? And that sustains the evaporative demand, that meets the evaporative demand, and that's why you have nearly constant evaporation rate. But when this connection is disconnected, when this hydraulic connection with the surface is disconnected, as you can see here, a new dry layer form at the porous media, and then there will be more resistance for evaporation. And because then you're dealing with the vapor diffusion through this dry layer, and that's why the evaporation rate goes significantly less. And actually, the mechanisms I explained, we clearly actually see that in an experiment in the lab, in the experiment, and that picture went to the cover of WRR, like I think it's for 2011, I guess 2011, where we show the formation of a new the vaporization plane inside the porous media as drying progresses during stage 2 evaporation. So that is what happened during in the case of pure water evaporation. But now the talk today is about saline water evaporation. Okay, so when we started to look into this project back then, we couldn't find any like a sensor or tools or something that can be used to quantify, to measure the dynamics or the concentration of the salt concentration in drying porous media with a high spatial and temporal resolution. So back then we decided to use synchrotron X-ray microtomography to quantify the dynamics of the solute distribution in drying porous media. So this is a typical example setup we have. I think the first round of experiment we conducted in S.M.S in Switzerland, and the second round was in Chicago in Aragon lab, so here, this is the picture, this is our column, the coin is here, just to give you an idea about the size I'm talking today. So you have the column, you pack with the grains, you saturate it with salty water, let it to dry, and then let's say, I don't know, every half an hour or every hour, we take the 3D scan of the sample and we continue the experiment, let's say for 20 hours or 30 hours, depending on what we are investigating, and then we have not only the spatial information about what's happening inside my porous media, but also temporal evolution. And this is a typical cross-section you get, the visualization you get. Of course, you do a lot of segmentation, etc., etc. I don't go through these things today. So here, the black color is the sand grain, the white color is the air phase, and the blue color is the liquid phase. And you see, we have now the distribution of the liquid phase in the drying porous media. But remember, the objective was how to calculate or quantify the salt concentration. That was our objective. Okay, and to do that, we used dual energy imaging. So here, this is the cross section of my sand, just the surface of my sand, and what we did here, we scanned the column with the energy that is higher than the kH value of the salt. Okay, and this is what you get in A. And then we scan the same column immediately with the energy that is less than the kH value of the salt, okay, that is required to detect the ion, okay? And then we subtract these two images, then the difference gives me the distribution of the ion. So let's just look at this picture at the bottom, okay? So this is exactly the same as top. I just here changed the color map to highlight my point here. Here, the orange, actually, let's just focus on this one, D, panel D, okay? So here, orange color is the sand grain, the red color is the air phase that is invaded by air, okay? And anything else you see here is the liquid phase, but you have different color because you have different concentration. Remember, when you started your experiment, the concentration was uniform. Let's say, I don't know, let's say I filled my sand column, I saturated that with the 5% concentration, right? But when you look at the pore-scale image, the concentration is different. So there are several messages in this one single panel. First of all, as you can see here, the large pores are preferentially invaded by air. And that's not surprising because the pores are large, the capillary pressure is less, then it is easier for the air to invade there, right? But the fine pores that are located normally at the grain contact, they remain filled with water. And they act as a kind of a chimney. Basically, they suck water to the surface, and evaporation preferentially occurs from these little spots, okay? And therefore the ions are preferentially deposited in this little spot, in this preferential vaporization site, okay? And since the different pores have different contribution to evaporation, therefore the concentration is different, okay? And I as well like to highlight this single pore here. This one, actually let me do it again. This one here, so the concentration, not only it is not distributed uniformly across the cross section, but also even within one single pore here, you see the concentration is different. At the center of the pore, you have blue color. By the way, I have to say, the closer to yellow color, the higher the concentration, okay? So you see at the center of the pore, you have blue color, that is less concentration, but when you get to the contact with the grain, the concentration gets higher, okay? So you see the process is far more complicated than a single assumption of, I don't know, the assuming like an average property at the cross section, okay? So now we have a tool to quantify. I have to assume the, okay, 20 minutes. Yeah, I have to speed up. So now I have a tool to quantify the concentration in drying porous material. So what we did, so our objective here is to look into the, let's say, texture of the porous media. What's the effect of the texture of porous media in ion distribution during drying process? So we had this experiment. I believe this was in Aragon lab in US, that you have fine textured material, coarse textured material, and then we do synchrotron tomography, exactly the same procedure I already explained in the previous slide. And so this is, you see here, this is the porosity of these two materials. I would say they're more or less the same, similar porosity. They were saturated with the similar salty solution. They were placed under similar evaporative conditions. So everything is the same. And then you see here, this is the mass loss that we measure. We can compute via the image analysis because we can calculate the area of the invaded zone over time, and then we can calculate the mass of the water versus time. They are not exactly the same, but they are not that far from each other. You see the mass loss is the same, the porosity is the same, under same evaporative condition, on the same salty solution, etc. The only difference is the porous distribution. So this guy, the red one, is the fine textured material, the blue one is the coarse textured material, okay? So although all of the parameters is the same, except this particle size, or let's better to say maybe porous distribution, we see a significant difference in the ion distribution. So here, what you see here is only the liquid phase, and the color indicates the concentration. Closer to the red, higher the concentration. This is the fine sand at the top, and this is the coarse sand at the bottom, okay? And as you can see here, only the difference in the in the particle size distribution, you see a very different pattern. In the case of coarse textured material, the bottom one here, you see the higher concentration close to the surface, the red color there, right? So you have like a stronger gradient close to the surface, while in the case of fine textured material, you have a more dispersed distribution, okay? And of course, you can, for example, use this information now here to, I don't know, let's say, for example, you can, every cross section, you can calculate your concentration, and you plot the curve here, that is concentration versus depths below the surface at different time from the onset of the experiment. And as you can see here at the, like a macro scale as well, we see higher concentration close to the surface here compared to the fine sand. And this is quite counterintuitive when you think about it, because the amount of the water is, the amount of the evaporated water is the same, right? So the color were the same. Let's say 1 gram of water has been evaporated from each case. So we would expect the concentration would be the same, right? But you see, the close, and in terms of spatial distribution, you have higher concentration in the case of coarse textured materials. And this slide I skip because I don't think we have enough time for that. But yeah, you can use this data, for example, to do convection diffusion equation, calculated dispersivity in porous material, because now I have the concentration profile. This is, for example, I see this is the analytical solution of the convection diffusion equation. You can do numerically and then fit that on the experimental data, get the dispersion coefficient, which is useful in many different fields. But I skip these things because the message of my talk today is something else. So here, so why that happens? Why do you see higher concentration in the case of coarse textured material? And the answer is here. So here what you see, this is the surface of the color from the top. Basically, you're looking at the top, right? And this is the wet patch distribution of the wet patches at the surface. Basically, the cluster of the liquid at the surface. Remember this conceptual picture I showed you that the water comes up. So when the drying starts, the large pores are invaded by air, right? And then the fine pores remain saturated. So you will have a cluster of the liquid at the surface that the evaporation preferentially occurs from those spots. So in the case of coarse textured material, you have less number of wet patches at the surface because the pores are larger, right? So you have less number of wet patches at the surface of coarse textured material. In the case of fine textured material, you have more number of wet patches. So the water comes up for evaporation. You saw the evaporation rate was the same. The evaporative mass loss was the same in this figure. I'm talking about this one. So the evaporation rate is the same. So the same, or nearly the same, let's call it. So the water comes to the surface. Water leaves the surface, but the ions are deposited preferentially at the surface. So in the case of coarse textured material, those ions are distributed among less number of pores. In other words, the evaporation, basically to meet the evaporative demand, better to say to meet the evaporative demand, the evaporation per wet patches in the case of coarse textured material is more than the evaporation per wet patches in the case of fine textured material, because you have less number of evaporation spot on the surface of the coarse textured material. I hope you're following what I'm talking about. Therefore, since the evaporation per wet patches is more in the case of coarse textured material, the concentration is higher there. Right? The concentration is higher. And you can see here, in the case of coarse textured material, you have this disconnected cluster of like kind of regions with high concentration, the red color, while in the case of fine textured material, it's more uniform. Okay?
Nima, can I have just a quick question on the topic?
Please, please.
So you said that the concentration is higher, but is this the concentration per patch or per
wet patches? By patches I mean this one.
Yeah,
the island.
What about the concentration per area?
This is the concept. The resolution of the picture you see here is I don't know, 5 micron, right? So this is the actual value you get at a very high spatial resolution. So I'm not averaging anything here. Right, so the picture you see here, so I don't know, let's say this orange part, you have like a lot of pixels there. The resolution, this is 10 millimeter, but the resolution is 5 micron, right? So I say that the concentration here, the red one, or here, right? So there are more than the concentration in the coarse texture, in the case of fine textured material. The reason being, in the case of coarse textured material, let's say this is coarse textured material, I don't know, let's count it, I don't know, let's say 10 wet patches at the surface. But in the case of fine textured material, I have, let's say, 1,000 patches. So that when the liquid comes up to the surface, the ions in the case of coarse are distributed among 10 patches. Therefore, the concentration in that wet patch here, as you can see here, will be, this is the color here, in this case shows the size of the patches. The concentration will be more in the case of fine textured material because you have many more wet patches at the surface. Okay? So and then you can say, of course, so why this matters? I mean, come on. I mean, okay. So why? So what? That so what? $1 million so what question. So what? So the rest of my talk today, I'm going to show you the impact of this very, I don't know, very small scale, very porous scale process, the process that occurs at the porous scale on different scales and on different responses that we see at the macro scale. The simplest part is just, so here this is the fine and coarse sand. You already saw this one. You already saw this one. So if you continue this experiment, of course, this is not the same experiment. That is another paper to 2015, different material. We have coarse textured material. This is coarse textured material. This is fine textured material. Here, the color is the depth of the crystallized salt. So here in the middle row, you're dealing with we are talking about dissolved salt. But at the bottom row here, I show the crystallized salt. So if I continue my experiment long enough, eventually crystallization occurs, and then the crystal starts to grow at the surface of the porous medium. Okay. In the case of coarse textured material, you get, like, let's call it patchy. Let's call it patchy precipitation or crystallization. But in the case of fine textured material, I get a kind of a crusty precipitation that covers the entire surface. And I believe that is because of this process, because in the case of coarse textured material, we see at the porous scale that the ions you have certain regions like disconnected, they're not disconnected, but you have like regions of high concentration, and those regions eventually turn into a precipitation spots, and then that's why you see a patchy precipitation. But in the case of fine textured material, since everywhere you have evaporation, those all these spots eventually turn into precipitating spots, and then they cover the entire surface. So, for example, this may have different impact on permeability if you continue the experiment long enough. Or I told you at the beginning, I'm looking at from environmental application. I can imagine, for example, that this one, the coarse textured one, because the closer to yellow is a thicker crust, that is probably less stable. So when there is wind, you can easily remove this dust, let's call them, and then you can spread it across the much longer distances in the land. That affects the crop production and so on. Okay, but still you can say, you know what, this is a still porous scale. You promised us, you talk about, I don't know, global scale. What is this? Okay, so why porous scale physics matters? So here I'm going to show you 2-3 examples at the larger scales. One is the effects of the water table depths. Okay, once no, actually, I was told that the presentation is recorded, so I prefer not to explain that one. I wanted to say memory, the memory I had. But anyway, the water table. The water table is the interface between saturated and unsaturated zone. Okay, so if you dig the land a couple of meters, you reach to a point that where the soil is completely saturated, and the interface between saturated and unsaturated zone is water table. Okay, but when there is so the question is, how does the depth of this water table, in case if you have saline aquifer, basically, how does the depth of this water table influences the evaporation from porous media? Okay, and so to do that, to study that, we did some experiment. I don't know where to put this one. So yeah, we did some experiment in the lab. This is the experimental setup we have in the lab. We use different type of the porous material that is fine textured, medium textured. It's sand material, actually, fine, coarse, and medium. Fine, medium, and coarse textured material. We measured the capillary pressure saturation curve in the lab, and then we could fix the water table using this Marriott siphon at a well-defined depth below the surface. So we did a lot of experiment here that with different concentration of the salt, that NaCl with the 9%, 17%, 20% at different depths of water table. These are the depths that we used, okay, for different materials. So you can see, and each round of experiment, it's about, 10 days, 20 days. So there were, maybe it took like 1 year to conduct all of these experiments. I skipped all of those results. I just wanted to highlight here this particular image that we recorded during our experiment. Let's only focus on this one. Forget the rest of this slide, just this one. Okay, so here what you see here, that is the surface of the sand. Okay, at 6 days, after 6 days from onset of the experiment, okay? This is fine textured material, and that here, the depth of the water table here was 4 centimeter, here was 16 centimeter. So for those who may not know, so this is the surface. I put my water table 4 centimeter below the surface, and in the other case, 16 centimeter below the surface, okay? And then the white color is the precipitated salt. So the process starts, some water evaporates, right? And then the concentration increases over time, and then eventually it precipitates and crystal starts to grow, okay? So as you can, and this number here is the amount of the evaporated water. And so interestingly, when the case was 4 centimeter below the surface, the depth of water table was 4 centimeter, you have a little bit more water evaporation even. But you see much more salt crystallization in the case of coarse textured material. Remember, they are under the same evaporative code. Everything here is the same, except the depth of water table. One is 4, the other one is 16. And the one who has more evaporation, you have less precipitation at the surface. And that what happens here is, you can explain it by this pore-scale physics that I explained here, that in the case of when you have deeper water table, you have less number of wet patches at the surface. The water content is less at the surface. You have less number of wet patches. So water comes up for evaporation, but since you have less number of wet patches at the surface, they reach the solubility limit faster. Therefore, you will have earlier crystallization and more precipitation eventually. We see that as well in the case of coarse textured material. Okay. So the take-home message here is that the deeper water table leads to more precipitation at the surface. I have to highlight here that you must have hydraulic continuity between the water table and the surface. Otherwise, what I explained here is not applicable, because here the assumption is you're dealing with a shallow water table, that the depths, the capillarity, basically liquid basically can reach that surface via the capillarity. Okay, and then as long as there is hydraulic connection between this water table and the surface, our experimental result suggests that you have more precipitation at the surface. And then, so here, of course, I was speculating. I was saying you have more concentration in the case of coarse material, therefore you have earlier precipitation. We didn't have sensor to measure the concentration throughout our column. So here our colleagues, Rainer Helmig and co-workers in Stuttgart, they did this simulation for us where you see the distribution of the ion basically at different depths below the surface. Let's just focus on this case. This is for the coarse textured material, 4 centimeter, 16 centimeter, and you see in the case of 16 centimeter, we have higher concentration compared to the 4 centimeter water table depths. Okay. And so this is not only the matter of the crystallization patterns, but also the formation of this crystal impacts the evaporation rate from the porous media. Let me play for you this little video here. Here you see a couple of grains. How much time do I have? Can anyone tell me? How much time do I have?
Around like 20 or 15 minutes.
Oh, perfect. I thought you want to say half a minute. Okay, 20 minutes, perfect. Then I don't need to rush. So here, what you see, I have a couple of grains here, okay? And I immerse them in salty water, and they're under microscope, and just let it to dry. Let's see what happens here. The evaporation starts, and then you see maybe now formation of some salt crystal here, for example, you see here, and then you see salt is, of course, evaporation starts, concentration increases, eventually crystal forms, and to me here, the surface is completely covered by salt. But you see the process doesn't stop. It continues, and you have more precipitation occurring, and the process continues. So presence of porous, so why that happens? So we believe the crystal that forms on the surface make a porous structure. And the water comes to the surface. You see, it is still continuing. You see the formation of more and more and more crystal at the surface. So water continues come to the surface and then flow through this porous structure, and then evaporation occurs. Okay, so let me read it from here. Presence of porous salt causes porous crystallized salt would be a better term. Presence of porous crystallized salt causes top supply creeping of the solution, feeding the growth of subsequent precipitation, as well as additional water evaporation. Because this suggests, if you assume when the crystal forms, then the permeability immediately reduces, right? Or the surface is clogged, there is no water evaporation, that may result in underestimation of your evaporation. Because this experiment shows that the salt is contributing to evaporation by further crystallization. And in fact, here I have a thermal image that the white color is the salt formed during evaporation. The process is still continuing. I take a picture, and you see the thermal image here. The closer to yellow is the higher temperature. You see here, wherever I have salt, is cooler. The system is cooler, and that suggests the water evaporation from that region. Okay. So that's a confirmation, okay? So, and then that is one of the, to me, one of the challenge of description of the saline water evaporation. These are some of the typical drying curve we got from that water table experiment. Let's just ignore all of them. Let's just focus on these two. I think that is enough to make my point here. So these two, the solid line is the pure water. The dashed line is the saline water, okay? So thermodynamic 101 teaches us that, or chemistry actually, chemistry 101 teaches us that when you add the salt to the water, saturated vapor pressure reduces, right? So an evaporation rate is proportional to the saturated vapor pressure above the surface minus P infinity. That is the kind of vapor pressure in the atmosphere, okay, or relative humidity, right? Because this you can write it as PS times 1 minus relative humidity, okay? So that means when I add salt, since the saturated vapor pressure decreases, the evaporation rate should decrease, right? So, but you see here, the dashed line and the solid line, the evaporation rate could be the same. And why that happens is because, I believe it's because in the case of the saline water, so you have salt form at the surface, and that salt has a rough structure, right? And that increases the vaporization plane basically, and then you have more evaporation. You have more evaporation. This is not the rate, huh? That is the amount of the evaporation, cumulative mass loss, okay? And not to mention the presence of this crystal as well, since it is porous as well that causes additional contribution to the water evaporation. Okay, so I like to read it from here. The final flux will depend on the interaction between the reduction of evaporative flux as a result of deeper water table and possible increase of evaporation due to the presence of the wet precipitated salt at the surface. Here, maybe I have to as well add that depend on the reduction of the evaporative flux as a result of deeper water table, and also when you add salt, the vapor pressure decreases. So these are the decreasing factors, but at the same time, formation of this crystal may enhance the vaporization plane and thus compensate that reduction. Okay. Yeah, you said 15 minutes. I have probably 10 more minutes, so I can. No, maybe I don't have enough time. So there is as well an effect of the salinity on the evaporative flux. I already discussed about that, but I'm going to skip that that one. But so I wanted to switch the scale that because in my title says from pore to global scale. So I think that's the last few minutes I spent on global scale. So the idea here was that so what we learned at the synchrotron X-ray tomography, we could use that to describe what is happening in the lab. But then the question was, can we as well translate some of this information, at least try to translate some of this information to the processes occurring at the global scale, okay? And so to do that, so we made use of the two global scale data bases that is available online. You can just go and download them. That is HWSD, where we can get the soil texture as well as topsoil salinity, that is the top 30 centimeter soil around the globe, as well as the global water table depths that gives me the water table depths that provides me information about the water table depths at any spot around the world, basically. And that is the the map of the water table depths, distribution of the water table depths. Okay, so now if I plot this topsoil salinity versus the water table depths, okay, so here I used the water table, the water tables where I had the information for the salinity. So wherever I had the salinity, I had the water table depths information. So I plot these two figures, these two quantities versus each other. Topsoil salinity versus water table depths. And here in this curve, you see about 11,000 data points. To me, when I look at this data, I don't see any trend. Actually, I don't see any relationship between topsoil salinity here and water table depths. More, I mean, okay, there is a little bit maybe, but to me, as from experimental point of view, to me, they're more or less the same. The variation is very, very minor. While in the classical kind of a hydrology, the view, we say that the shallower water table may result in, I don't know, higher salinity and etc. But the data doesn't suggest that. The data that is gathered on the global scale doesn't suggest that. And that is because this is not only the depths of the water table, it is the combination of the depths of the water table, the texture of the soil, and the evaporative demand that determines the salinity. So here, we said, okay, you know what, let's filter this data. Let's only focus on places where the water table depth is either 1 meter or 2 meters. Okay, because there the chance of having hydraulic continuity between the water table and the surface was higher because the depth was 1 meter. Okay, so if you apply this filter, you end up with 350, I mean something around 350 points. And now I have, if I plot topsoil salinity versus the texture of the soil. So in that database, the soil is classified as fine textured, coarse textured, medium textured, etc. So if I plot the topsoil salinity versus the texture of the soil for 1 meter depths and 2 meter depths, okay, and you see here for 1 meter depths, which probably that you have the highest chance of the hydraulic continuity between the water table and the surface, we have higher concentration in the case of coarse textured material, okay, and that is in fact in line which we see at the very small scale, that in the case of coarse textured material, because you have less number of wet patches at the surface, if you have hydraulic continuity with the surface, since you have less number of wet patches at the surface, the concentration were higher in our experiments compared to the fine textured material. So the same phenomena we see in the lab scale and we see on the global scale, okay? Based on my calculation, I guess I have at least 5 more minutes left. And if that is the case, so here, I wanted to talk a little bit, I have maybe 3-4 slides about one of our very recent research, and it is ongoing research, is about, again, global scale salinization. And I wanted to spend the rest of my talk on that. That the paper was published on the 29th of December, 2020. So it's like 2 weeks ago, where we use artificial intelligence to predict actually the soil salinity on a global scale. So what we did here, the paper is about, with the supplementary information, is more than 100, I think 120-30 pages, roughly, more than 100 pages. So we made all the codes, the data, everything is available. That the thing that we use for machine learning and the experimental data and all that. So if you're interested, and it is open access as well. So if you're interested, please look into the paper. Here I just showed just 2-3 slides to show some of our results on the global scale. So this is the experimental data available, okay, from the many different resources. And in the paper we refer, we say where the data came from actually. So here we use this data. I think it's about yeah, you see, you said you're recording that, so I don't want to provide so I don't know whether, I think it was about 200,000 data points, but it might be a little bit less or a little bit more, I don't know. But about 200,000 data points you have here. And so what we have, we have one column, 200,000 data points, okay, of the salinity and sodicity, by the way. We are looking into salinity as well as sodicity of the soil. So we have 200,000 data points. And then we choose 43 different parameters, okay? 43 different parameters. These are the parameters we use This is the parameters we used in our modeling. So we have 200,000 data points in one column, and then we have 43 different parameters. You just, I don't know, you just soil temperatures, clay content, sand content, slope, precipitation, all of them are listed here, right? So I have one column, 200,000 data points. I have 43 other columns basically, and in each column I have parameters that are available in different resources, governmental resources, in UN, I don't know, in different databases. And then we use machine learning algorithms to establish a model between this target variable here for me, that is the salinity, and these 43 parameters. So I made a model relating the soil salinity to these 43 parameters, okay? And then when I have the model now, then I can apply it across the globe to get the salinity on a global scale, okay? And then the comparison between our prediction, that is the vertical line, and that is the observed values on a global scale. Okay, so we have here 40,000 data points for salinity, about 140, 50, or 60,000, or maybe more, I don't know, 150,000 data points for sodicity. Okay, so that is prediction versus the observed value with the R square for 72%. Okay, for the scale that we are talking about, this is quite satisfactory. And just to give you an idea how good it is, so this is the prediction versus the observed value. Prediction versus observed value. The orange color or the yellowish color is our prediction, and the brown color is the prediction from HWST when it is compared with the observed values. The HWST is a very common database that is used for description of the salinity on a global scale. For example, FAO, UN, they use this database. Okay, and now I have my model. Then I can predict the salinity with a spatial resolution of 1 kilometer on a global scale. I see Mohammed Hussein is already on, so that means I should finish now. So there is a little video as well. We can as well do that we can make, for example, on a global scale map for different years from 1980, I guess, to 2018, how basically the salinity is evolving over time. And we can do a lot of things now, for example, on a continental scale, how in Africa, Asia, Australia, things are changing in terms of salinity, in terms of sodicity in different years. And this is my last slide, that we can get information on country level. So all of them are on that paper for all the countries around the world. The information is there. And so these are typical examples for a couple of countries where we see a very strong trend, actually. When we look at, for example, Iran area of the, I think this is the, sodicity area affected by the sodicity versus time. And you see very strong trend, or Saudi Arabia, or I don't know, China, Brazil, Kazakhstan, and Sudan, and everything. So you can see how actually things are evolving over time, and that can provide you a lot of information for soil management and making, hopefully, policy to address this problem. And that brings me to summary and conclusion of my lecture today. That is, I think I can say I talked a little bit about fundamentals of saline water evaporation from porous media. We talked about the pore-scale preferential solute deposition, and as well as its effects on crystallization patterns. And we talked a little bit about the interaction between water table depths and soil salinity. And I think I can say, I tried at least to say a little bit about linking the processes occurring at the smaller scale, at porous scale, to what we see at the much larger scale. And I think that is the main outcome of, not necessarily outcome of my research, but my main message today is that we do a lot of work on a smaller scale. You just Google it and you get tons of papers on X-ray tomography, they visualize things, etc., all these interfaces on the porous scale processes, but I see much less effort to connect what we learn from a smaller scale to describe processes at the larger scale. And you don't need necessarily to go to the global scale, but at least we need to put some effort for upscaling. Otherwise, all this information, so we just don't know where to use it, right? So it would be great to see more efforts on that front. And then I like to acknowledge the work. All of them were by my students. I'm just presenting the results. So they did the job. The full credit goes to my students, thanks to Salome Michel Shokri-Kuehni, Mansoura Nourouzirad, Bernadette Raaijmakers, Teresa Kurz, and Ishwan Hanan, Amir Hossein Hassani, and Naresh Salvaraj, who did all the experiments, analysis, figures, and everything. And as well as I would like to thank Danny Orr and Rainer Helmig for their contribution to this research. And the research was funded by multiple sources listed here. And thank you for your attention. Any questions?
Thank you so much. It was an awesome presentation, Nima. Is there any question from the audience? Marcel, you have to unmute yourself.
All right, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Hey, I see you have a couple of questions. Thanks a lot, Nima. That was a really, really cool presentation. I have one question on the technique. So you showed concentration maps of salts in the X-ray images. How is the calibration done for that? How do you turn like the X-ray intensity into concentration? Is this based on some analytical model, or you do some calibration curve for that?
It's a very good question. So before starting the experiment, we have an empty column. We fill it with different concentration, right? 5%, 2%, 5%, 10%, 20%. And what we did here with the dual energy, we do exactly the same on that column, okay? And because there I know what is the concentration, and then I obtain a calibration curve between this difference value I get here and the known values of the concentration. So I get a very, very strong linear curve actually, and then I use that curve to convert the gray value to the concentration. Yeah.
Right. Super.
And the detail of this procedure and with the relevant data, all of them are shown in this paper as well as the 2018 paper, scientific report 2018 paper. You can see the detail on our website. So in case if you're interested, all of them are open access.
Right. And something else exactly about this slide. So you showed the mass loss there as a function of time for two different samples, one with fine sand, one with coarse sand, right? And as you said, they're very similar. So why would you expect them to be similar? I mean, like with the fine one, you probably have much finer connections between the top layer and this the bed, right? Many more connections, but much smaller. But somehow these two effects seem to compensate to give like a constant flux rate independent of how coarse or how fine the sand is.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question again. You are full of good questions, Marcel. So these are, let's say, some grains here, right? And this is the surface. Let's say you have some liquid here, some liquid here, and some liquid here. Actually, maybe not some liquid here. And since the surface is partially wet, right? The vapor saturate, the evaporation rate is proportional to PS minus P infinity. And here is PS, that is the saturated vapor pressure, and this is P infinity. The saturated vapor pressure, since it is partially wet, the surface behaves as if it were like fully saturated, because the vapor covers the entire surface, right? The vapor covers the entire surface. It behaves as if it were saturated. So PS doesn't change that much. Doesn't change that much when the water content reduces. And that's why they call it a stage 1 evaporation. The concentration, the evaporation is more or less constant, because you can ask the same question for the stage 1 evaporation. You can say, Nima, you start from 100% water content, you go to 20%. Why do you say the evaporation rate is constant? As you can see in this picture, here the water content probably is, I don't know, 20%, while here is 100%. Still, it is the same, because that 20% is enough for the saturated vapor pressure to cover the entire surface. And then the evaporation rate will remain constant. When the continuity with the surface is disconnected, When that little water as well is gone, the saturation goes to zero, or I mean to when the continuity, not to zero, but when the continuity with the surface is disconnected, as it is showed schematically in this figure, then the evaporation drops. Okay, that's why it is the same. You're the same.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any other question? You can unmute yourself or raise your hand.
I have a question.
Yes, of course. I mean,
thank you for your interesting presentation. You talked about mainly abiotic processes. I was wondering if there is a biotic process that may affect salination in soil.
Absolutely, absolutely. I didn't discuss about that, and we didn't work on that. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That is another factor. That is that could be a very interesting aspect to look into that. Yeah, but we didn't do that.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
okay. Thank you so much, Amin, for your time and for the awesome presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to see you guys today. And yeah, stay healthy and take good care of yourself. Keep in touch.
Keep in. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.